I'm happy to have Mary Christie with us today for the first time to talk about her novel, Blind Tribute, which is several five-star reviews on Amazon. Mary, can you tell me just a little bit about what your book's about?
My book is about a newspaper reporter in the Civil War who has divided loyalties. He has spent his adult life in the North, working at various newspapers, but he grew up in the South. And so at the start of the Civil War, he has to decide how he is going to cover the war. And he decides to move south. And so that's the start of the book, and really the premise.
And your main character, you said, is a famous journalist. Do you see any parallels between his role as a member of the press then and now?
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels, and there's also a lot of divergences. On the side of commonalities, he lives by a code of ethics that has been around in the journalism profession since about the 1920s, so not quite as long as he's been around. And so he lives by things like reporting without bias, always being truthful, telling everything on both sides of the issue, the sorts of things that one hopes that journalists are doing today. And so we have that commonality that he lives by ethics that journalists are still living by now. Those ethics were a part of the fairness doctrine, which was started in 1949. And that basically said that anyone who had a broadcast license had to present controversial issues of public importance honestly and showing both sides of the issue. And that was until 1980, that was the law of the land. We don't now have that. And so, that has caused its own problems. As far as divergences go, in the 1850s and the 1860s, every newspaper was associated with a political party, and every political party had a newspaper. And so there really wasn't a separation between the news and the politics at all. And so, journalists weren't really expected to report without bias. And so, the 1850s in that case are very similar to where we are today. After we lost the fairness doctrine, the environment went a little bit toxic, maybe a little bit.
I was just thinking, wow, that sounds scarily like today. It's like,
right,
it's like when you watch one, it's like, oh, that sounds like that political party. And then you watch another one and it's like, ooh, and that's that political party. Well, where's the news? I got to watch the BBC, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to tell you, Harry would be horrified at the way that news is running now. He would be horrified at the idea that opinion has become equivalent to fact. He would be horrified at the 24/7 media environment and how fast things go and things, fall by the wayside. These truth falls by the wayside, in fact.
Mm-hmm. So Mary, tell me, how did you come up with Harry Wentworth?
Harry Wentworth is based on my great-great-uncle, who owned a media outlet in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. He ran a media outlet called Whaley Eaton Press, and it was actually a very, very well-known press. He was a famous journalist before famous journalists existed. And so I took his life and his experience with Whaley Eaton, and I translated it and moved it to 1860. And so it's based on him. It's not necessarily him because it's a 70-year difference. Mm-hmm. But it's absolutely based on him, and he's based on what I know of my great-great-uncle. And what I have researched about my great-great-uncle.
Did you meet your great-great-uncle?
I did not. He died before I was born.
And so this is a book that's takes place during the Civil War, and there's just tons of books that are about the Civil War and movies made about the Civil War, and you decided to place this during the Civil War. Why that time period? Just because of the similarity to what's going on today?
A little bit of that. And, you know, the book, in many ways, the book wrote itself. And the Civil War is the milieu of this book. So we're not actually going into battles in the war. We're not. It's not a war book, but the war is the overall setting, and the primary influence on the character.
Okay. Well, that's kind of a different take on the Civil War, getting out of the war and into something else as far as journalism.
He writes about the war. And so we see some of his editorials in the book, and so he writes a lot about the war. So we are seeing some of the war, but we're seeing it through his eyes.
Did you take any of this from maybe some people that were writing back then as journalists?
I did not, but I took the voice from that time period. The voice that he writes in is very, very much a period voice. He writes like someone who would write in 1860, but no, I wrote all of the editorials myself.
Oh, perfect. And so I can see now why you were saying it seems more relevant today, which we live in a very different world, but in some ways it's almost exactly the same.
Oh yeah, no, it's very much almost exactly the same. The media environment is exactly the same as it was in the 1850s, except that it's faster and has more reach. That's exactly all. But you know, we're still bitterly divided. There's still talk of states seceding. We still have racial tension that's running high. You know, I would argue that there's a lot more things that are the same between now and 1850 than are different.
I hate to say this, you sound just like my husband.
Is your husband a Civil War buff?
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
It's really hard not to draw the parallels when you start doing the research. It's just, the parallels are just so stark.
Yeah. So what do you feel like the role is of an ideal press? How does that matter to democracy?
To my mind, and actually to Harry's mind too, the press acts as the fourth leg on a three-legged stool. So we have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. The media watches over them all. So the media becomes the fourth, they call it the fourth estate, right? So it becomes the fourth leg on that three-legged stool of democracy. And that brings some balance. It makes things a little steadier, right? Like, metaphorically speaking. So essentially, I think that a good journalist and a good newspaper and a good media outlet it puts checks and balances on all the branches of government in ways that can't be accomplished by the government itself. You can't watch over your own ethics. It's just not viable.
So what is the message that you'd like readers to take away from your book?
I just want people to think. I want people to evaluate what's different about the 1850s and today, and where are we in terms of the Civil War, you know, today versus 1850? How far away are we, really?
That's a good question. Well, Mary, thank you for taking time with me today. And if you would like to buy her book, check down below. I'm going to leave a link so that you can go in and purchase it. And I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.